how old were you when you directed your first film?
36.
And then how old were you when you directed Nightmare on Elm Street 2?
38. I thought I was old, but I'm a lot older now. So my name is Jack Sholder. I'm a filmmaker, writer, director, editor. I also started the film program at Western Carolina University and ran it for 13 or 14 years, and I'm now off doing other things. Well, I would say as a director, I'm really an editor-director. I, I started out as an editor, just sort of, I graduated from college with a degree in English. I never took a film course. Made some films in college just on my own. We ordered a bunch of equipment and tried to figure out how to do it. And when I moved to New York, I looked up an alum from my college, and he gave me a little bit of work doing editing. If he'd given me some work as an assistant camera, I might have ended up as a cameraman. I don't know. So I started doing some editing, and I kind of had a talent for it because I also had a musical background. And most of the good editors that I know either play a musical instrument or are musical, because editing is very musical, because it works like music. It occurs in time. There's a macro rhythm, a micro rhythm, and then of course I have my English literature background, so that's story, and that's basically what editing's all about. It's story and music in the most general sense of music, as well as in the literal sense of music. Sometimes we edit music, and so my goal was to direct my first film by the time I was 24, like Orson Welles. That didn't work out. I directed some short films that did pretty well in festivals and so on, and eventually got my break when I was in my middle 30s. But I kind of think like an editor, so I kind of think in terms of structure and, all the pieces, the shots that you need to make up a film. I always felt that I was weak visually. Obviously, I'm strong musically. I think I had a good sense of how to tell a story. I also was writing screenplays. And I made a great effort to learn about acting. I did some theater in college, and I studied with several acting teachers, but I always felt that that was the hardest part. So I worked on trying to develop my visual sense. I mean, I always went to museums, and whenever I traveled, I would always go to museums. I would look at art, and I would try to understand how it worked. Working with actors was always a little bit of a mystery, and eventually I kind of figured it out. But really, as a director, I think like an editor. I mean, when I'm shooting, I'm kind of like seeing the pieces cut together, or I'm seeing if I'm shooting a take. I know I'm going to make a cut here, so if I got this first chunk good, when I do a second take, I'm not trying to get a perfect take. I want to now get the second chunk good. So it's very helpful to have that background. Well, I mean, when I was an editor, I was cutting film. Okay, I didn't learn to. When I started directing, the first 4 or 5 movies I did were on 35 millimeter, and then after that moved to digital. I mean, we shot 35 millimeter, but then it was digitized, and we edited with pretty much Avid was the one that everybody used at that point. And I always would say to the assistant editor, once we locked the film, why don't you show me how to use this? But somehow I never got around to it. So I had to figure it out when I started teaching, because I was teaching directing classes and I was teaching editing classes. So I knew everything there was to know about editing, but I didn't know anything about digital editing, which is kind of different. With digital editing, you just kind of can throw all the shots together and then you start to manipulate them. When you're cutting film, you have to cut the film, you have to splice it. If you cut it 2 frames off, you have to cut 2 frames off, and then you have all these little pieces that are hanging around. So you wanted to really find the exact right place. And when you're cutting with film, I used to think that there were almost like invisible marks that would say cut here, cut here. When you would see a piece of film, there would be a spot cut in terms of the rhythm of the speech cut, where you could just feel the cut, because each shot kind of sets up its own rhythm, whether it's the rhythm of people speaking, or the rhythm of their movement, or the rhythm of their walking, and I could always feel where I felt like the right spot to cut was, and if you cut exactly on the right spot, the piece has a tempo to it, and it's. I actually, when I first started editing, I was doing this little film, and it was about a day in the life of India. The guy who had hired me shot a documentary, and he shot a lot of footage in India for the documentary. And he said, why don't you see if you could edit something together and make a little like educational film about India. So I thought, a day in the life of India, and I thought, because I had read about Eisenstein and all the Russians, and if you know anything about that, if you don't, you should find out about it. But the Russians felt that what distinguished film from the other arts was editing. People think, all about these visuals, but really they felt that it was editing, and they did a lot of experiments with editing. So I thought, well, I'll start the day off slowly, and then as the day gets, you see people walking to the well, doing all this stuff that they would do in the morning, that I would keep making the shots sort of mathematically shorter, that they would be 8 seconds, and then they'd be 6 seconds, and they'd be 4 seconds. And when I did that, it completely felt out of whack. It didn't feel like it was in tempo, because what would happen is that one shot would have 4 beats in it, let's say. If you're thinking about a piece of music, it's 4 beats in a measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. But the 4 beats might be different from shot to shot, because if I'm talking slowly, the 1, 2, 3, 4. But if I'm walking along faster, 1, 2, 3, 4. So each shot would have its own tempo, but there would be 4 beats, but the beats would be a different tempo. So you couldn't do it mathematically. So you had to kind of find those little invisible marks. When I hire an editor, I look at their work. I can look at 5 minutes of their stuff, and I can see if they feel like those little invisible marks are the same place that I feel them. And the good editors, the editing has a rhythm. If you turn the sound off, you might not feel the rhythm, because part of the rhythm is often generated by the dialogue. But I worked with one editor who I didn't hire. I was working on an episode for a show for HBO called Vietnam War Story. There were these half-hour dramatic films about Vietnam, and with TV series they hire editors who then cut the different episodes, usually a couple, some 2 or 3. And I got this guy, and he was very quick, but he basically, okay, that's good, okay, and if you didn't jump out of your seat, it was fine. And when he was done, it just didn't quite, and I went through and I would say, take a frame off here, add a frame, and we must have made like 50 minor adjustments of a frame here and a frame there, and then all of a sudden it just had this flow to it that it didn't have before. I mean, I think if somebody who didn't know anything about film, or even somebody who did know something about film, they'd watch his cut, and it would be fine. And then you would watch the other cut, and maybe you'd notice it was marginally better, but it was better. So, anyway, that's my take on, well, one of my takes on editing.